Okay, so I'm Erin Robbins, and I'm with the Manitoba Emergency Measures Organization. So I am the Manager of Mitigation with EMO, and I'm here today to speak about disaster planning in buildings. With me today to help me answer any questions that you might have at the end of the presentation, I have Robert Belton, and he is the Acting Supervisor of Recovery and Assessments for EMO. And as well, I have Sean Moran, who is the EMO Training Coordinator. And thank you, Laura, for doing the land acknowledgement because I had that down, but you've done it for me already. So thank you so much for that. So I'll just give you an overview of my presentation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about emergency preparedness to start with. That's a big part of what EMO does. I'll talk a bit about disaster financial assistance and just briefly. So that's a program that we administer on behalf of the federal government within Manitoba. I'm also going to talk a little bit about overland flood insurance. Then I'm going to talk more about specifically about typical damages that we do see in Manitoba during DFA events. Um, just to give you a sense of sort of what's happening out there during the disaster events, because that will help you prepare and plan better. And then the bulk of the presentation will just cover some um, tips for adapting buildings and adapting the property around buildings to be more resilient to disasters moving forward. And then there will be time at the end for questions and answers if you have some. So what is emergency preparedness? Emergency preparedness includes all activities such as plans, procedures, contact lists, and exercises undertaken in anticipation of a likely emergency. The goal of these preparedness activities is to make sure that you are ready and able to respond quickly and effectively in the event of an emergency. So as we all know, the more prepared we are, the easier it is when we're putting our plan into action. This is especially true in emergency management. If we know what the risks are in our area, we can plan for them in advance so that when they do happen, we know what to do and we can do it quickly. How to prepare. So it's important to prepare in 5 main ways, and I'll just cover them here because these are pretty critical in the field of emergency preparedness. So first, effective emergency management requires an understanding of the potential risks within the community which may occur as a result of an emergency or disaster. The principles of risk-based all hazards emergency management are implemented through a comprehensive analysis of the potential hazards that could affect your community, the risks that a specific event will occur, so how likely it would be that a specific event would occur, the possible vulnerabilities in your community or on your property should a hazard event occur, the adverse impacts that a hazard event may have on identified vulnerabilities. Second, it's important to educate the community about risks and talk about disaster readiness. It may involve sharing information resources or talking about it in a community-led discussion. Third, there may be government programs, and you can ask your municipal government about programs to prevent disaster damages. So it's always helpful to ask and to know what's available. Fourth, and this one is really important, is to know your insurance coverage. So insurance is available for most disaster events. Even overland flooding is widely available in Manitoba. And some insurance providers even provide coverage to mitigate property in advance of a disaster. Overland flood insurance most often has to be purchased in addition to standard home insurance. So you're not automatically covered, and it's important to know what your coverage is. Finally, you should find out what you can do to prevent damage. I will talk about adapting buildings and property toward the end of the presentation for flood events. However, how you prevent damage depends on the disaster risks in your community, and it's important to educate yourself about what those risks are and how you can mitigate your buildings and property. So there are many resources currently available to help individuals, businesses, and communities for emergency and disaster planning. Manitoba EMO has many brochures and downloads on our site that pertain to preparing your family for an emergency, as well as preparing at your workplace. Things such as looking after pets, emergency preparedness for farm animals, what to do to prepare for floods, what to do after a flood, sandbag dike construction, power outages, and severe storms. So we really provide quite a few resources on our site for any emergency event that could happen in Manitoba. It also has resources for preparing for specific emergencies such as floods, severe storms, tornadoes, and more. And for communities, there is an emergency plan template that will assist in assessing the current situation to determine how prepared you are and planning for potential events. So I just want to quickly show you the link, if I can here, to our site. Kind of move it into my screen and hope that you can still see my screen now, which is on our website.
It's still just the PowerPoint.
Is it
But
okay?
if Robert or Sean wants to drop it in the chat, that would be great. The
You
link.
know what? I can actually find it now in my share screen. I think.
There you go,
Okay,
nailing it.
perfect. I'm getting better at this. Um, so this is our website, and there's one section on the left-hand side navigation bar, and it's called Prepare. And so that really offers a whole bunch of information, and it's broken out by information for individuals and businesses, so more at the individual level. And then it's also broken out by information for communities. So the communities information will really guide you through thinking about what the risks might be in your community and how you might prepare your emergency plan or your community plan based on those risks. And then on the individual portion, there's lots of information about how to prepare at home and prepare at work for emergencies. You can also click on the prepare for specific emergencies. So once you have developed or you're aware of the risks and hazards in your specific area, you can come here to learn more about how you can prepare for those specific emergencies. So like I talked about, floods, severe storms, tornadoes, winter power failures. So those top four ones are sort of the events that we've seen in the last few years in Manitoba, and those are the ones you'd want to key in on. And I'm going to go back to my presentation. Okay. And I just also wanted to let you know that Public Safety Canada also has a number of resources available. One of them is the Emergency Preparedness Guide for the first 72 hours. So that's really an individual or family level emergency preparedness guide to make sure that you're prepared for an emergency at the house level. And then they also have a program called Flood Ready, which has a wide variety of resources on protecting your property with flood ready fixes, as well as resources, posters, videos, and brochures you can share with your community to increase awareness of emergency and flood preparedness. I just want to quickly touch on the Disaster Financial Assistance, or DFA program as we call it, because it is a big part of what Manitoba EMO does. The DFA program is administered by the Manitoba Emergency Measures Organization, and it provides assistance for certain disaster-related damages when the impacts create an unreasonable financial burden. So although this program does exist, it's only offered in cases where there has been an extreme event that has caused extraordinary and widespread damage, where most of the damage is uninsurable, and it has created an unreasonable financial burden for the communities involved. So it's really in those events that are very widespread in nature. DFA should not be seen as a funding source for improvements to local community infrastructure or homes. And then DFA, when it is provided, it really only assists with the basic and essential costs to bring a property back to its pre-existing condition and does not pay to improve properties or infrastructure to a more resilient state. So Manitoba really mirrors the federal guidelines that are outlined in the disaster financial assistance arrangements, because we do cost share programs with the federal government. So we have to follow their framework in Manitoba as well. And I just wanted to make a quick note as well that for disasters on First Nation communities in Manitoba, Indigenous Services Canada is responsible to provide assistance to First Nations impacted by disaster. So that's just an important note as well. Overland flood insurance is now readily and widely available in Manitoba by most insurance providers. So, on renewal of your insurance, it's extremely important to ask about overland flood insurance and to consider switching providers to find more comprehensive or more affordable coverage for overland flooding. It's also important to note that, as I said before, DFA assistance, if there is an emergency or if there is a disaster event uh, that is DFA eligible, it really only covers basic and essential needs, and insurance will offer much more comprehensive coverage for overland flood damages. So some insurance providers, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, they will also offer funds to mitigate properties against flooding in advance of floods. So it's important to shop around and find the best provider for your needs. Just also remember that DFA does not provide assistance to insurable perils such as sewer backup. So it's very important to ensure you have this coverage. In addition, the DFA program right now is sort of in a transition period, and we're currently considering whether DFA assistance will be provided in future flooding events in Manitoba because of the high availability of overland flood insurance. We're currently planning a campaign to raise public awareness about overland flood insurance. So, your emergency planning process in your communities will help you to focus on the disasters and vulnerabilities that are most pertinent to you. But in Manitoba, we have to be particularly focused, sorry, on spring flooding, heavy rain events, and severe storms like ice storms. In the past several years, these have had the most impact on Manitoba communities. And just a note as well, Manitoba has really expanded its flood risk mapping to include more watersheds in Manitoba. And we're also continuing to do this over the next several years. And that's so that we'll better understand where overland flood risks are the greatest in Manitoba. So with this information comes a greater need to prepare and plan for areas that have elevated flood risks. At Manitoba EMO for the 2020 DFA programs. So those programs were spring flooding that happened along the Red River Valley and the heavy rain events that you might remember that happened in early June in Southeast Manitoba and in late June and early July in Southwest Manitoba. We've seen the following damages to buildings and homes. So overland flooding, including damages to both basements and main floors of structures. We've seen sewer backup. We've seen basement flooding from seepage. We've seen erosion, which may undermine and compromise building foundations. We've seen hail damage to roofs and siding. And we've seen wind damage to roofs and siding. And this may result in additional flooding within the building as water enters through missing shingles and siding. So those are sort of the more common damages that we've seen over the past several years. So I just want to give a little bit of maybe a preface to my section on adapting buildings that I wouldn't consider myself nor Manitoba EMO experts in the topic of adapting buildings to ensure the flood readiness of properties. Um, we at Manitoba EMO would always point individuals and communities to trained professional contractors and engineers to ensure projects are completed to increase a building's resilience against disasters. But I have come across resources in my work that I can share with you and invite you to visit these resources to learn more. So the first set of building or property improvements that you can make today to flood-ready homes and buildings. You can use water-resistant building materials for renovations below ground level. So that's really important if you're doing a renovation to look for those building materials. You can put protection sealant around basement windows and the base of ground level doors to help stop water from entering those areas. You can install floor shields or barriers for basement windows and doors. So the tops of the shields should extend above ground level. And you can raise large appliances, furnaces, hot water heaters, and electrical panels up on wood or cement blocks above the potential water level. And of course, under the supervision of a qualified contractor as well. If an item can't be raised, you can consider anchoring it and protecting it with a flood wall or shield. Anchor fuel tanks to floors. So just remember that in a flood, a fuel tank can tip over or float, causing fuel to leak and potentially catch fire. So make sure vents and fill line openings are above flood levels. And if you do use propane, contact the propane company before making any changes. If a flood warning is in effect, it's important to shut off electricity to areas that are at risk of flooding. And just remember to move furniture, valuables, and electronics to the safest place. So it's always best to permanently have these on the main or second floor of a house and not in the basement. But if you do get that flood warning, try and move your valuables up to the main floors into higher areas. And also, just a really important note that make sure any documentation that you have for such as property tax information, property tax bills, your insurance paperwork, that's all up in a higher place in your home and kind of ready to go, that if you have to leave, you have a folder that you can take and grab with you, because those documents are really important once you leave your home. Um, You can also make sure your plumbing system and drains follow code requirements. So that's really important. Also installing backwater valves or plugs for drains, toilets, and other sewer connections. Just make sure your sump pump works. Test it every so often. And it has a battery backup as well. And then also you can install a water alarm that will let you know if water is accumulating in your basement. So that's a really good strategy as well. There's just some things you can think about as well to adapt your outside property outside of the home or business to make sure that it's flood ready as well. So the first thing you can do is make sure that your lot is properly graded. So if possible, build up the ground around your property so that water can drain away from basement walls. Make sure downspouts extend at least 2 meters from your basement wall, and water should drain away from your property and neighboring properties. Check that your roof and eaves are draining properly in heavy rains. So I know my house is always, my eaves are full of either pine needles or leaves. And in a heavy rain, you notice them overflowing, and the water is literally pooling right around your foundation. So you want to make sure those are cleaned regularly. Also, check your sidewalks, patios, decks, and driveways to make sure they haven't settled over time and are causing water to drain toward your property. You can also clear snow away from the building's foundation. So if the ground is sloped 1 inch per foot near the building, moving snow just 3 to 5 feet from the building will reduce problems. You can also use a rain barrel to catch water runoff. And you can consider planting a rain garden by using landscaping as a way to catch and disperse water in the soil near your property. Using native plants and vegetation that resist soil erosion are really helpful in a rain garden as well. So one resource I found that was particularly helpful and was much more in depth than those quick tips I just gave you. Uh, it covers building adaptation techniques like elevating buildings, moving buildings, wet flood proofing, and dry flood proofing. And I put the web address there. So it was on the US Federal Emergency Management Administration website, but I found this guide was very comprehensive. And so I did include it there in case somebody wants to go and get more information on these types of fixes to make a property more flood ready. So I've just popped my information up there on the last slide. If you wanted to get in touch with me or the DFA program to ask questions after today's session. And then right now, myself, Robert, and Sean can take questions that you might have right now.
All right. So, Erin, if you just want to stop sharing your screen, I'll add Sean and Robert as the
Sure.
spotlights.
Yes.
Sean and Robert, if you just want to start your cameras. And so starting with the first question we have here, have you seen damage to buildings or other infrastructure in the north with respect to melting permafrost?
I'm not I couldn't answer that right now, but I could find an answer for you. And I'm not sure if Robert could answer that question either.
So Sean, we've got you spotlit, but you are muted. Robert, you're off mute and you are now spotlit. There you go.
Oh, thanks.
So Robert, I don't know if you heard the question. Maybe Laura, you don't mind repeating it?
Not one bit. So have you seen damage to the buildings or other infrastructure in the north from respect to melting permafrost?
That's a really interesting question. I would say no, not in our recent disaster financial assistance programs. Most of those have been in southern and agricultural Manitoba. So especially being that a lot of northern communities will, like Erin said, fall under federal jurisdiction when it comes to disaster response. We haven't seen that in our programs, no. But that's certainly an interesting thought going forward. Yeah, thanks for that.
So our next question, as infrastructure is highly vulnerable, can you talk about any community-based planning / programming your department is doing implement community-wide mitigation for increased climate-related events?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So we have a new program that just launched last year, and it is called the Mitigation and Preparedness Program. So it's a program that municipalities can opt into when they do have, fall under a disaster financial assistance program that's cost shared with the federal government. So I know that's a lot of qualifications, but for last year's heavy rain event in southwestern Manitoba and the spring flood in the Red River Valley, those municipalities are able to opt into the program. And in the past, municipalities paid a deductible as part of the DFA program, but under this new program, they can actually opt to keep their deductible and then invest it into mitigation and preparedness measures that will increase resilience in their communities. So that's one program that we have right now. And if you want more information on that specific program, we're actually just building the website right now, and it will be up on the municipal relations site. So it's not our departmental site it will be up on, but Manitoba Municipal Relations. And Municipal Relations also last year had a couple of funding programs. They had the flood preparedness program that it was an application-based program that has closed now. And then also a climate resiliency program. And that was also an application-based program that has closed now. But the funding is available a little bit more readily now. And then the mitigation and preparedness program that I just mentioned is an ongoing program that will be available for any communities that are in a disaster financial assistance program moving forward. So.
Okay, thank you. And we're just going to take one last question. So sorry that we can't get to them all. What are the projections for increase or decrease of wind damage in Lower Manitoba? So there are some questions about like whether or not there's any data about how climate change is going to impact and things are going to change. Just looking for projections.
I don't have it. Oh, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, so the one about the 5 out of 10 emergency scenarios on your website about related to climate change. So we don't, as far as I know, unless Robert or Erin have some other information, we don't really carry any data about that effect, but we have been a part of a few working groups at the national level since about 2017 that have been looking at, you know, those situations. So they've been doing it to make sort of exercises as to how to exercise towards climate changes, but no real data to say statistically this is what's going on, if that answers the question.